Now we'll turn to the Torah parsha. Chanting before we open the Torah. And this is on page 67 of our prayer book here. The bottom. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, udvar Adonai merushalayim. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, udvar Adonai merushalayim. Baruch shenatan Torah le'ama Yisrael b'kedushato. Baruch shenatan Torah le'ama Yisrael b'kedushato. Ay alalai 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 ay alilalai alalilalai ay alali alalai alai ay alilalai ay alilalo. Baruch shenatan Torah le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato. Baruch shenatan Torah le'ama Yisrael b'kedushato. Baruch Adonai Hamavorah. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam. Asher Bachar Banu in Kol Ha'amim. Benatan Lanu et Torato. Brucha Yashechina Notenet HaTorah. Amen. And before we jump into the Torah reading, Shabbat Shalom. If you've just joined us, thanks for being here. It's lovely to see your faces. If you're able to turn your camera on, we love seeing you. And I understand if you can't, and we don't care if you're eating while your camera's on. That's all good. Don't worry. So we're continuing in the saga of Jacob and his family, which goes on for quite a while. And oops. So this is if you remember 2 weeks ago, I said the Parsha has a lot in it, and we basically went really deep into the first part and didn't finish reading the Torah Parsha for that week. We might end up doing the same thing this week. There's like not a line that doesn't matter in this week's. I mean, the sages would say every word, every space, everything matters. And of course that's true. And like every single line in this Parsha is just really rich and deep and complex. And it's just the ongoing saga of the trauma of our people, the deep imperfections of our ancestors, and the key themes that I thought we'd focus on, and we'll see where we go, are the idea of settling and what it means to settling in a land, the theme of jealousy, which continues in this week's Parsha, as we've seen through siblings from the beginning with Cain and Abel. And then in this week's Parsha, we also have dreams. Again, remember I said at the beginning a couple weeks ago that dreams are a big theme in this month of Kislev. This is most of the dreams in the Torah are in this month. And maybe it's because, right, it's the darkest month of the year and we spend more time sleeping and resting, or at least in darkness. And maybe in that space of darkness, we spend more time dreaming as well. They're over there. Yeah, perfect. Second shelf. Yeah. And so we'll get some interesting dreams and how dreams are used. And then I'm hoping we might skip ahead to talk a little bit about how women use their power in patriarchal structures and systems of disempowerment. And we'll see in this Parsha 2 different ways that women exercise their power. Some of the ways are similar and some are different. So I think we're just going to jump in as we do it, right? Somebody's going to start reading in English, and I'm actually going to jump in right away. I'm just going to give you the heads up, like we're going to get through a sentence or two, and I'm going to pause us because the first theme that I want to talk about is this idea of settling. And the very first line of this parsha you'll see is about Jacob settling in the land. So if somebody would be willing to read literally just that first sentence.
Okay, I'm reading. Now Jacob was settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in, as I said. So here's an interesting contrast, right? Like Jacob is settling in this land, but his father hadn't settled there. His father sojourned there. So right here, we're seeing a distinction drawn between settling and sojourning in a land. So I just want to name that and see if anyone wants to, before I share a little bit of a teaching or a drash here, I just want to open it and see if anyone has thoughts about this distinction between settling in a land and sojourning in a land. When you think of those two words or concepts, how do they differ for you? What do you think about?
Well, sojourn is still right, actively traveling, journeying. It's not settling. It's not making those kinds of commitments. It's still spectating isn't exactly it, but you're in motion.
Right. Almost like traveling through, not landing, not making home.
One feels temporary, and the other feels permanent.
Yeah. Yeah, Roger.
It means it usually means you're doing settled agriculture. So you're creating an economy and you're creating relations with whoever happens to be in the area.
Settling. Yeah.
Settling, yeah.
Neil, did I see your hand?
Yes. Everything that's said, I agree with. And the major contrast on the social level is if you're a sojourner, there is no fixedness to it. There's a wide range of possibilities and limitations. If you're settled, again, to be settled means that you're rooted, that you have some kind of social connections, and that's a double-edged sword. In some ways it's useful, in some ways it means accommodating to complex interactions because cooperation outweighs the adversarialness of things, which is often the position of social reformers as opposed to revolutionaries.
Right. Thank you. Right. Andre, beautiful.
Settling, this is probably too political, but settling has an element of taking in my mind. If you're settling, there are two sides of it, and there's a taking, whether it's of the land or of people or something, but there's something more than just passing through, and there's something willful about it.
Thank you. Yeah. So there's another interesting piece in this, right? Because it's acknowledging that Jacob was sojourning in the land. I mean, Isaac was sojourning, and Jacob was settling in this land. This was the land that was promised to Abraham and his progeny, right? But it wasn't their native land. So to me, it's really interesting when I read this is literally they're settlers in a land that was not their native land. That's not where they were born, right? Isaac is sojourning and Jacob is settling in this new place. So that we've talked in the past about this fact that Abraham came from elsewhere and then came to Canaan and was being given different land. And if I think about this in the context of this present ongoing struggle in Israel-Palestine, where, right, many Jews make the claim that we have a biblical right to this land because God promised it to us, and we can have a just debate about that. I don't know that here we need to do that. And by the way, Andre, I don't know that it's ever too political to say something here. But I think that's the whole purpose of what we're doing here, or at least one part of it. But what's interesting is that Jews who read this Torah literally as God giving this land to us don't seem to acknowledge that even in the Torah, the land wasn't our native land. And so even in the Torah, Jacob is a settler. He settled. He settled there, a place that wasn't his original home. So Isaac was a sojourner and Jacob was an alien to the land. So that's one component of it. So the other thing is settling in a land. It's really interesting what this midrash does with it, with this terminology. So let's think for a moment before I offer it out. Let's just think about when we feel settled. Just think about feeling settled for a moment. What does that evoke for you? Like when you're feeling settled? Or what are you yearning for if you're yearning to feel settled? Like if you've moved from place to place and you're like, oh, I just want to settle down, right? What does that evoke? I see Jeff and then I see Debbie. And if you want to talk, you can just jump in. Yeah, Jeff, please.
Oh, I think it has to do with home. You want to feel at home.
Yeah.
You know, if you go someplace to settle, you want to eventually feel at home there.
And when you feel at home, then when you have that feeling, what happens? Like, what do you do? How do you engage? How do you move in the world? Yeah, Debbie, please jump in.
Okay, so my gauge for whenever I've moved is when I'm out and about that I see people I know and say hello. Like that's my sense of like, oh, I'm starting to feel like this is home. You know, I go to the store and I run into somebody that I know. So sense of community.
Mhm. So this is an amazing midrash. There's a midrash that implies that after his long exile from his home and struggles, remember Jacob fled because he stole the birthright, then he saw Esau, and then he still fled. He didn't go settle with Esau where Esau was. Jacob wanted to finally settle down in tranquility. He just wanted some peace, right? He just wanted to relax and put his feet up, kind of like Moses did when he fled Pharaoh after he killed the taskmaster and he went to Midian and he kind of became a shepherd and he settled for a while. And then God comes to him and says, no, you have to go back. And Moses is like, I don't want to go back. I want to just stay here and be settled. And, you know, I can't really blame Jacob, right? When you're transient and you're moving around and you're fleeing like you do, you want a place that's home where you can settle and relax and have some tranquility. But he couldn't do that, right? Even we'll find out as we read this parsha that even here in this place where he's settling, there's all this strife. There's all this angst pursuing him, anguish. And so, you know, we're going to read how Joseph ends up being sold into slavery and Jacob's told that an animal killed him, right? And Jacob, his favorite son, is now gone and he's devastated. And so the Midrash provides a really shocking and provoking critique of Jacob. Now, before I go there, I just want to check in with Glenn if you want to jump in and add something before I share what the Midrash critique is, because it's really quite fascinating. We need you to unmute. There you go.
Yes. Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning.
I wanted to say two things. One is right now I'm feeling like a sojourner in the congregation, so to speak, in the community. So it's the first time I've been with y'all for a very, very, very long time. And
Yeah.
so I really I'm physically feeling that sense of apprehension, a certain amount of discomfort, a certain amount of not sure what the role is, how to do, and so forth. It seems to me that those are all qualities that the sojourner has, and that to even continue to sojourn in a place for me is I haven't found my community. It's not only a place to rest and to be alone, but it's also a place to be with community. And I haven't found it. And I guess the other thing is that if I'm mistaken, you said that Isaac still was sojourning in Canaan. He was still, in a sense, he hadn't found that community. Did you or did you not say that?
Well, that's what the parsha says, that he was a sojourner there. So yeah, it's so he hadn't, right, he was a sojourner, whereas Jacob settles. Because he had to flee. Jacob fled from where his dad was.
Was he?
Yeah.
Okay. That's all I wanted to say, I think.
Thank you. Well, it's good to have you back, and I hope you settle. I hope you feel settled.
I do too.
Thank you for being back. Okay, so here's what the Midrash says. When the righteous live in tranquility and seek to live in tranquility in this world, meaning when Jacob, being a righteous person, we could debate whether Jacob is righteous, but the Torah makes Jacob and the rabbis make Jacob very righteous. The accusing angel comes and denounces them. And this angel says, is what is prepared for them in the world to come not sufficient for them, that they seek to live in tranquility in this world? In other words, if you want to be a righteous person, you don't get to just have tranquility in this world. You don't get to just settle. And how do we know this? Because when he sought to live in tranquility, he had all this problem with Joseph, with his family. And so, in other words, what they're saying is a righteous one has an obligation to stay engaged in the world and not simply to disengage and become complacent once their lives feel settled and okay. So this is like, to me, this is radical, right? In other words, if we want to be righteous people, and even if we're imperfect, because Jacob was so profoundly imperfect, even after he wrestled and got the name of Israel, like he's just a mess. So we have to stay engaged. We have to commit to continuing to fight for and struggle for a righteous world. And this is really, for me, a counter message to the message of, well, once you've just worked toward your own spiritual enlightenment, once you reach your spiritual enlightenment, you can settle down and that'll help the world get better. No, this Midrash is saying, even if you've had a rough life and you're coming to a place and you want some tranquility, if you want to be a righteous person, now, if you don't want to be a righteous person, settle. But if you want to be a righteous person, then you don't get to kick your feet up and settle too much. You got to stay engaged and try to make the world better. And there's a Ishbitzer Rebbe, Rabbi Mordecai Lehner, who takes it even further. And he says that Jacob's withdrawal is because he's striving for moral purity and wanting to avoid the doubts and complexities of reality. So we can see this sometimes, like we want to be engaged in movements, right, that have moral purity, and yet being involved in movements and trying to gain political power and transform society sometimes requires that not every moment can we be clear about what we're doing, or can we have moral clarity, moral purity with ourselves or with our partners. Like, it's messy, right? It's really messy. And the second thing he says is that reality requires us not to concern ourselves with our moral perfection, but to engage in loving action. So it's not about whether we're morally perfect. We can strive for moral perfection, but what helps us get there and what we need to really engage in is loving action. Peace is obtained when a person behaves in such a way as to keep far from all doubt and guards himself from evil act. But in response to Jacob's desire for peace, right? He just wanted to go settle in the land and have some peace. Can you relate? Right? We can relate to that, right? But in response, God told him that as long as a human being lives in a bodily existence, it's impossible to behave with extreme wariness, fear, and humility, because God wants human acts. And God wants human beings to act with love, even if it's not always clear what that means or what that looks like. And so it calls us to engage in the world, even when we don't have total moral clarity, even when the partners that we work with sometimes maybe don't engage in the ways that we want. But settling requires that we stay engaged to build a loving and just world and engage in acts that will help us do that. And I was last Shabbat, after Shabbat in the evening, I was at a talk by the leaders of Standing Together. Standing Together is an organization in Israel-Palestine working for peace and justice for everyone in the land of Israel-Palestine, greater Israel-Palestine, the whole land. And one of the directors, there's been questions and critiques depending on where you fall in the movement's efforts about this organization, because BDS movement, for example, was really critical of them, saying that they're normalizing what's actually happening, and he spoke to that. But the other thing he said was that they are trying to build political power. They are trying to build enough political power to be able to transform Israeli society so that they can build a society that's equitable and just for all peoples in the land. And so he talked about the fact that sometimes they have partners and they have speakers at events that don't have the moral clarity that they'd like, that they don't really align with on all points. And his point was that this is important in this moment because we're trying to build power and we're trying to transform Israeli society. And this, when I was reading this midrash and thinking about this, it really spoke to that for me, right? Like, I may or may not agree with that strategy. It's not really for me to say, I don't live there. But what he's saying is exactly what this midrash is teaching, which is that we have to engage in loving acts, even if we don't have moral clarity, and even if we don't have moral purity. So I thought that was pretty radical teaching. So Rick.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of Shal Magid's concept of the necessity of exile, and that maybe we need to be exiled from being settled, from a feeling of being settled. We might need to be exiled even from a sense of moral purity. Might need to be exiled from wanting a sense of wholeness and completeness. We might need to be exiled from the land. And I think the necessity of exile sort of invokes a sojourner mentality rather than a settler mentality.
Yeah.
I'm drawn to that, and the parallels seem pretty interesting there.
Great, thank you. Thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, we had a conversation with Shaul Magid. I think you can still watch if you go to our website, where we had a really rich conversation with him. Rachel, please.
Thinking politically, I was thinking Bernice Johnson Reagan said that if you're in a coalition and you're comfortable, it's not a broad enough coalition. And so either you're sojourning or you're settling. But if you're settling, it's not right.
I love that. Thank you for bringing that in. That's so great. Yeah, we have to keep pushing our boundaries to grow and expand. Yeah. So Shifra and then Jeff, I saw your hand after that.
Well, it's a slightly different point, but at the end of the story, when Jacob and Esau, when they meet, and then Esau says, or Esau says, you know, how about us living together? And Jacob begs off, and it just makes me wonder what would have happened if he had said, well, I'm going to go home and, you know, see the folks and stuff. But yeah, I wonder what would have happened. Instead, there's a separation and they become like Rome, which is another one of the Jews' enemies. And I just wonder what might have happened had he made a different decision. Yeah. Just
Right.
makes me wonder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We discussed that a couple weeks ago. Yeah. Jacob still wasn't able to overcome his trauma and trust that Esau was really caring, right? He didn't trust it. He was still afraid.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Jeff.
Yeah, so I think that the real challenge is to be a settler and remain engaged, you know, remain a righteous person. Because when you're a sojourner, it's almost like you have less to lose. But when you settle, you've got real things in the society. You own stuff. And so if you have to, that's the challenge, you know. It's like it's almost easy to be a sojourner and talking about this is the thing to do. But to settle and to remain righteous seems like the hard thing to do and what we need to do. You know, also when you talked before about a righteous man, a righteous person, righteousness, it seemed like should engage in loving acts. It seems like that's not just righteous people, but all people. So then what is a righteous person? Is a righteous person somebody who engages in righteous acts? So then if they don't, they're not a righteous person. You know, so a bunch of thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I love the idea of the complexity and the challenge of settling and being righteous, right? Like that's what you like, right? How even here, right, in this land that we're on, that's not our land where we've settled. Like what would it look like to actually engage in loving acts and uplift righteousness and be righteous, right? That to me is where teshuva, reparations and repair, where truth and reconciliation, where acknowledgement of the past comes in. And as Rachel said, well, if you start bringing that in, we're going to get really uncomfortable. We start to hear and read and understand what's really happened in this land or in Palestine. It's really unpleasant. And yet that is what's going to make a righteous world. That is what's going to make a loving, just world. Yeah. Thank you. Evelyn.
Hi. Good to be
Hi.
here. I was just thinking of the whole thing about a righteous person, because a lot of times in the Bible, there's like the person who's wicked and the person who's good. I kind of like to think of that as progression. Who is the righteous person? I mean, if it becomes a superlative, and you've got to be this, who is righteous? So I see it more as a process that we just try to be the best people that we can be. We engage in, you know, acts of helpfulness and kindness. So for me, righteousness is a little bit of a misnomer, because then it can also really, I'm just thinking of this, it can lead to a lot of, what do you call it? Arrogance. Oh, I'm more righteous. I'm really the righteous person. And I think that's very dangerous. So I think humility is really, really important here.
Yeah, and they mentioned humility in this too, right? There's a continuum, and none of us, no matter how much we strive to be righteous, are fully righteous. We're imperfect human beings. We all miss the mark. So yeah, thank you for that. Andre.
I'm struggling with how to make this part of my life, being 1,000 years away from the Torah story or whatever. And I was thinking, I was relating it to relating it to the Nishmat prayer or poem, where the world is waking up and it's the most natural thing for all of this beauty to wake up, and for the hawk to cry out, for the crow, for the Leviathan in its natural way. And I'm thinking for me, it really would be nice or ideal if my awakening would be an engagement, so that it comes naturally with each day that I am engaged as best I can, whether God help us a righteous or less righteous way, but to make the engagement as natural as the way in which the world wakes up.
That's just really beautiful, Andre, the way you connected this back to that poetic awakening, right? And so, yeah, what you're really saying here is how do we awaken, whether we're sojourners or settlers, right? What does awakening mean and look like? And to me, it also relates to what was said in the Midrash, which is like engaging in loving acts, right? And even for you, Evelyn, like that continuum, if we engage in loving acts, then we're always on the path toward righteousness. Probably never actually fully get there, right? But because we'll undoubtedly engage in unloving acts. But as we increase our capacity to engage in loving acts, or to not engage in unloving acts, maybe just be neutral, we're on the continuum and journey toward it, and we're always awakening. And again, like you said, Andre, in that prayer, but also in our morning prayers, it talks about, right, every day we get a new soul. Every day we get to re-embody ourselves. Every day we get a new opportunity. Every day the world is recreated, not just ourselves and our souls, but the whole world. And I think, why is that? Because we're all engaging in it every day. And so every day we can recreate the world in a more loving and just way. And settling doesn't alleviate of us that obligation, right? It still calls us to engage in that. Which is, to me, I see you, Neil, one sec, which is interesting because like you were saying, Jeff, like when you travel, right, every day kind of is an awakening if you're traveling, right? Because you're like, particularly if you're traveling to new cities and new places, every day you're kind of awakened with something new. And when you settle, it does become, right, we become more complacent. And I think that's what this is warning us against. Even when you're settled, don't become complacent with what is, even if it's good. Don't become complacent. Continue to engage in loving acts. Continue to try to make the place that you're settled more just, more loving. Continue to love the stranger. Engage in acts that demonstrate that love. Build a society that's a reflection of those values. And continue to struggle. Neil.
Yes, one of the symbols of Judaism is the Star of David, which has a triangle pointing upward and pointing downward at the same time. Lots of different, shall we say, fields in between with open space. So the two premises that Judaism rests on are tikkun olam and tikkun nefesh, the integration of the personal self and the engagement of the world towards more loving justice. It's paradoxical in how to integrate the two, and from a different paradigm, they use the term to transcend and include, which is exactly what it sounds like. Integrate the parts you can, but don't just, oh, what a relief. I'm a good guy. Things are stable for me. I treat the immediate people around me okay. end of story, but doing that and simultaneously striving towards the unfoldment of a justice and love that is more inclusive.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you. Sarah. Oh, Roger, you're next. Sorry. Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, me first. Okay. So one of the concepts that I really appreciate about Judaism is the notion of the Yetzer Hara, that inclination toward evil that exists in us. And I did not grow up with a Jewish education, so I could be getting this wrong, but my sense is that a truly righteous person is aware of that inclination to evil. And in the settler mindset, for me, and I think in Israel and in other places, like there's such a way that the inclination towards evil makes us close our eyes and our minds to the people we've displaced or are continuing to displace in our living. And that in order to be truly righteous, we have to be constantly aware that we still have an inclination toward evil in us. And it's not just, like an individual thing, but it's a participating in whole systems thing.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Roger.
Yeah, well, listening to this, it sort of occurred to me that settlement is a pretty new thing. I mean, we've only done it for like 10,000 years, so it's kind of an unnatural thing to our species. So that's why people struggle how to work it out, what it means, and how to do it. So through the vast majority of our evolution, we didn't settle.
We were sojourners. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, beautiful. Okay. Jeff, did you want to say one more thing and then we'll keep going? We only got through one sentence so far. Isn't that amazing?
Just briefly. So the other thing, because you mentioned about the stranger, and the other thing about sojourner versus settler is that, and somebody said, the settler knows people in the community, but the other, and the other thing is, if you're a settler, then you can, let's say, look at people and go, oh, that's a stranger. And the sojourner is the stranger. So, like one of the things, what I feel is like when I move to a new place, the thing that makes me feel most at home, or I say, oh, I live here now, is when I see somebody who doesn't know where they are and I can point them, oh, that's this, the supermarket is over there. Suddenly they're the stranger and I'm the person who lives there. So that's another, and the other thing is about righteousness is that, if you call yourself a righteous person, you're probably not a righteous person. And that's a lot of what's going on in society, these days, like everybody, I'm the righteous person, but, that's a pretty good sign you're not, so anyway, that's.
Yeah, I really, I'm appreciating your, the second thing you said was funny and I appreciate that. The first thing that you said about it being a sojourner in a land, you're the stranger, but when you settle, you can see the stranger. And if you, in Exodus, it says, we were sojourners in the land of Egypt. We were the strangers in the land of Egypt. So it really does speak to that. Like you're sojourning. And so Isaac was sojourning through this land and he was a stranger, but then Jacob settles and he becomes not the stranger in this land, although he still is in many ways. So thank you. Okay. I think that we can continue to read. Yeah, we can start. Debbie, you can pick up.
Okay.
Oh, did you lose the power to? Funny. Okay.
Yeah, I think you just need to make me co-host again, Rabbi.
Oh, did you leave?
No, my internet.
Okay, I think. Oh, your internet got funky. Okay, give me 1 sec. I'll make you co-host. Sorry, guys. Technical. Is co-host good enough, or you want to be host?
Co-host is fine. Yeah.
Okay, you got it. There we go. All right. Funky internet.
Okay, this then is the line of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Now, Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons. He was his child of old age, and he made him an ornamented tunic. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him, so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. Once Joseph had a dream, which he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I have dreamed." There we were binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaf. His brothers answered, "Do you mean to reign over us? Do you mean to rule over us?" And they hated him even more for his talk about his dreams. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I've had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars are bowing down to me." And when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father berated him. "What," he said to him, "is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you on the ground?" So his brothers were wrought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind. One time when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock in Shechem, Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "I am ready." And he said to him, "Go and see how your brothers are and how the flocks are faring, and bring me back word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. When he reached Shechem, a man came upon him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I am looking for my brothers. Could you tell me where they are pasturing?" And the man said, "They have gone from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he could come close to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer." "Come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say, 'A savage beast devoured him.' We shall see what comes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood, cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves, intending to save him from them and restore him to his father." When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing, and took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and laudanum to be taken to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, he said, "The boy is gone. Now what am I to do?" And they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it not your son's tunic?" He recognized it and said, "My son's tunic, a savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast." Joseph rent his clothes, put on sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh, and his perfect, whatever.
Defect.
Oh.
And we're going to interrupt. Pause here. Thank
Yeah.
you, Debbie.
Sure.
So let's talk about jealousy and hatred for a little bit. Here's more examples of brother jealousy and hatred. So Joseph is the daughter of Rachel, right? Rachel being Jacob's, all these names I get confused sometimes. Rachel being Jacob's favored wife, the one he wanted first, but he got tricked by Laban to marry Leah. Bilhah and Zilpah are the handmaids that now in this parsha, they're uplifted to be his wives. One of the commentators says that they became his wives after both Leah and Rachel died. Rachel died while giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother by the same mother. Okay, so is that family dynamic all clear? So these brothers have been raised in a home where they're very clear and very, very much experience the power dynamics of being children, not of the favored wife. So just as has happened previously in our family, in this ancestral history, right? The parents themselves are creating this sibling rivalry. And that's really what happens in families, right? Like kids have some level of jealousy between them seeking their parents' love, but parents can either uplift that or undermine that and create a family home where there's not this rivalry. Well, here, Jacob he gives Joseph a tunic, an ornamental tunic. Now, I have a story about what this tunic is, which is totally a midrash of mine, which is that Jacob took cloth from Rachel, like from her scarves or her shirts, and sewed a tunic together for Joseph, so Joseph would have something to remind him of his mother, to connect with his mother, to nurture him. So I also want to acknowledge that Joseph, everyone in this story is traumatized, right? Everyone's complicit and they're all traumatized people. And Joseph his mother dies and his father gives him, I argue, this gift of his mother's cloth to wrap himself in, to remember her, to hold her close to his heart. But the brothers are terribly jealous. So I'm sure that we all in our lives have experienced jealousy at one time or another, whether we've been jealous or been on the receiving end of other people's jealousy. So what do we do with that? How do we navigate our feelings of envy and jealousy in ways that would be more life-serving? Right? Because it's hard when you feel envy or jealous. And in a society in which we're constantly told or experience not enoughness, both psycho-spiritually in terms of our feeling of not being enough, but also not having enough, not thinking there is enough materially to survive. There's this jealousy that gets exploited by political leaders, right? To try to exploit and weaponize the class inequalities and make people think, oh, well, you could just get there if you just did these things right. But in fact, if people are hoarding, then there isn't enough. How have you navigated feelings of jealousy, whether you're on the receiving end or on the actual end of feeling jealous? Evelyn.
It's a personal story.
Yeah.
This is a personal story because it's with my brother, as Schiffer knows, my friend Schiffer, who's on the line. And such jealousy on my part as a younger sister and an older brother growing up in a family in Reformed Jewish family in Northern California. And I think the circumstances don't really matter that much. How did I resolve it? Forgiveness. And it really points to the fact of the parents, because I understood that not necessarily favoritism, but the preference, let's say, had to do with my parents, not with him. So matter what he engages in is a result of how he was raised. And none of this was conscious. Like, I'm not talking about the jealousy. For me, it's very unconscious. It's just a feeling. It's so strong. It's so powerful. It overtook me. Just the process. I would say, oh, I have to forgive my brother. No, it wouldn't work. It was more of an understanding. It was like a eureka moment where I said, I understand that it's not us. And it's just what you were saying, Rabbi Kat, that it's from the parents. I don't want to say that every situation is like that, but in my situation, the forgiveness stemmed from me understanding that was like a setup. And so for me, forgiveness is absolutely crucial in how to resolve jealousy.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Gratitude is a real huge antidote to jealousy, and also just empathy and learning so often in life that the people who I am jealous of because I think they have it all together and have a perfect life don't. And that they're suffering in other ways that I'm not suffering, and just trying to have that broader view and that humility and gratitude for what I do have.
Beautiful. So a couple anecdotes are forgiveness and gratitude. These are good resources to remember, right? To hold on to. Gratitude and forgiveness are important for so many things, so many antidotes to so many struggles in our lives. Thank you. Mark.
Yes, I want to not only echo the gratitude and forgiveness, but I find one of the benefits of you will, of aging, at least for me, I mean, the more I realize the absolute finitude and shortness of life, I find that sort of propels or fuels kind of a forgiveness and gratitude practice. In other words, as the end becomes inexorably closer, it's like, well, how much of this do you really want to keep holding on to? And what good will it have done you to hold on to it to the very end? And so when I keep sort of, means testing some of these problematic feelings that are in me or these things I haven't resolved, that is a way for me to, to help fuel kind of the releasing of a lot of stuff that I maybe have carried too long in my own life.
Beautiful. So letting it be, putting it down. There's a Buddhist teaching that there were two monks. It might have also been a rabbinic teaching. I've heard it in so many different traditions. Two monks, two rabbis walking by the river, and a woman needs help crossing the river, and the monks and the rabbis aren't supposed to touch a woman, but one of the monks just picks her up and carries her to the other side of the river so she's safe, and then the monks continue down the river, and then the younger monk turns to the older one and says, but that woman that you picked up, and the elder monk says, "You're still carrying her? I put her down back at the river." Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot when I find myself still carrying things that I don't really need to carry, and yet I don't want to say, "Just let it go," because that seems so like, I forget who said that, but one of you said that, like, just saying "let it go" doesn't. You said that, Evelyn, like, it doesn't work. But if you can just let it be and say, "I don't need to hold this anymore," whether through forgiveness or gratitude, or like you're saying, Mark, just recognizing I've held it, I've been carrying it around long enough. I'm gonna put it down now. Thank you. Yeah, Rachel.
Well, thinking of the story of Joseph and his brothers, after after seeing their father's grief, the brothers change. Maybe it takes a while, but by the end of the story, it's very different. They feel different. So it's a it's a learning process for them. And certainly I found it in my life that sometimes seeing the consequences of something I do out of jealousy or some other negative feeling helps me to move on from it.
Yeah.
And having to make some amends and make things right.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Liz.
Sorry. I have two things, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The first is that sometimes I used to get jealous of like my cousin's opportunities, and I used to think, well, I would want to do that. And I realized, I've come to realize that, just like I believe Sarah was saying, everyone's got a story, everyone's got a challenge. Just because you can't see it, or just because you don't know it, doesn't mean that you're not walking, but like, just because you don't see it or you don't know it does not mean that that person doesn't have a story and like a challenge in their life. And so I've learned that. And the other thing that's really helped me is to be very grateful for what I have, because I have so much that when I get really grumpy and I start trying to count all of my blessings, I really can't. I can't do it. There's so many of them that I can't. There's so many things I'm grateful for. I can't. I don't think I can put them all together.
Mm.
And then the second thing is that Benjamin is also a son of Rachel, right?
Yes.
Why Joseph then? Why not Benjamin? Why is Joseph taken out, and why is Benjamin not as special?
So a couple things. Benjamin is very young still in the story, and Joseph was the first son of Rachel's. So he was the first son. Jacob was older, and I was just reading about this, that Jacob and Joseph had more time together to develop a relationship that he didn't have yet with Benjamin. And Joseph, we can see, he's like telling them about his dreams, right? So he's like playing into his father's uplifting of him as special or as being more powerful, or by telling these dreams that seem to say, "You're going to bow down to me." Now we're going to read about that happening in a couple weeks, but next week and the following week. But that's part of what's going on here. Benjamin, they've been brothers with Joseph a lot longer. Benjamin's young.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Neil.
This is an example of a sad story with a resolution to it. All throughout Genesis, we're getting cautionary tales of bad family dynamics and how it sets the wheel in motion. The first two brothers, out of jealousy, resulted in Cain murdering Abel. However, the last snapshot we get of brothers in Genesis is Judah willing to sacrifice himself to free Benjamin, and the resolution of going from focus on oneself and one's deficiency needs to developing a sense of empathy and a wider connection, where Judah basically tries to plea bargain. If you let Benjamin go so that it doesn't break Jacob's heart, I will stay here in his stead and submit to servitude. And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're
about to read some more about that. Yeah, some development there. Yeah. The other thing we see more of, right, is dreaming here, right? Joseph has these amazing dreams that actually do foretell what's going to happen. But he shares them with his brothers and his father, which seems a little audacious, right? Like, why are you sharing these dreams that basically say, "Oh, I'm going to rule over you"? Not once am I going to share this dream, but twice. And the sages have different ideas about why he would share these dreams, knowing that, or maybe not knowing, the impact of sharing them. So one says he was young and immature and didn't realize it would inflame them. He was 18, so I don't know, like certainly psychologically young. Another sage said he thought if he could convince his brothers that his eminence was divinely decreed, that they would stop disliking him. That seems a little off to me, right? Like he's going to convince his brothers that he's got this divine rulership that's going to come over their brothers, and that therefore they're not going to dislike him. I don't know. I think that would sound a little bit full of himself. Another one says, by showing them that they were dependent on him, they would realize it was unwise to hate him. I think they're grappling here, huh? Grasping at straws. And the last one said he understood that his dreams were a prophecy, and that prophets are forbidden to conceal what must be revealed to others. And I struggle with that one, because is it wise to reveal dreams if you're a prophet, if it's not life-serving for you or other people? And like when Isaiah is prophesizing, what he's doing is he's explaining to the people how they're living their lives that are not aligned with the teachings, and what the consequences are going to be based on what we've been told, based on what the prophets have been told, and also based on what had happened to the people. So he wasn't telling them about a future that would unfold. He was reflecting on the future that was unfolding and the consequences that would naturally unfold from that. So I don't know. I think that it's problematic that Joseph obviously told his father and brothers these dreams. And yet I think that I could also understand that if Joseph is feeling unloved, his mother's died, so his father loves him, but he doesn't have sibling love and connection. And I think that a lot of times we act out when we're feeling disconnected and unloved and not part of the family or the community, right? He was feeling unsettled, let's say, and he acted out. Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, yeah, that's what it sounds like to me. I mean, it's two things. On the one hand, it's just kids saying I'm king of the hill, but on the other hand, it's some sort of complex that he's trying to overcome. And the reason he tells them dreams, whether he had the dreams or not, it's sort of an argument from authority.
Yeah.
Saying,
Yeah.
Here, I'm great, and here's why I had these dreams.
Yeah. Yeah. Evelyn and Shifra.
I'm also thinking that he wasn't the oldest son. Reuben was the oldest son. So maybe there was some jealousy there. And he was trying to show them that, and in his insecurity, that I'm better than.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's definitely some insecurity there. Yeah, thank you.
You're
Shifra.
welcome.
Shifra, you just turned off your camera. I'm not sure if you're still there and you want to share something.
Let me check.
I think that we will continue. If it's still alive for her, she can share it. Let's keep reading, because now we're going to get to an interesting story about Judah and the first act of women's power.
Someone else read.
Someone else willing to read.
I can read.
Thank you.
About that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her into his household as wife and cohabited with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. She conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. Once again, she bore a son and named him Shelah. He was at Chazib when she bore him. Judah got a wife for Er, his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. But Onan, I'm so confused, but Onan, knowing that the offspring would not count as his, let the semen go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, who took his life also. Then Judah said,
I'll just explain in case others are confused too. So Judah gets married and they have 3 sons. The first one he marries to Tamar, and God is displeased with the first one and takes his life. The second one then steps in to marry Tamar because of the laws at that time. If the brother dies, the older brother dies, and the younger brother marries the second son. So he steps in and marries a son, but he wasn't happy about that. He didn't want to have a child with her because it wouldn't be his, it wouldn't count as his. So then God is displeased with him, so God takes his life. Does that help, Evelyn? Yes. Okay, keep going.
Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hira, the Adullamite. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing. So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you," for he did not know she was his daughter-in-law. "What," she asked, "will you pay for sleeping with me?" He replied, "I will send a kid for my flock." But she said, "You must leave a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your seal and cord and the staff which you carry." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adullamite, to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. He inquired of the council of that locale, "Where is the prostitute?" The one at Enaim by the road. But they said, "There has been no prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her." Moreover, the local council said, "There has been no prostitute here." Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I did send her this kid, but you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is pregnant from harlotry. Bring her out," said Judah. "She should be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her brother-in-law: "It's by the man to whom these belong that I'm pregnant." And she added, "Examine these, whose seal and cord and staff are these." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he was not intimate with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out a hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify, "This one came out first." But just then it drew back its hand, and out came its brother, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Peretz. Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was the crimson thread. He was named Zerach.
Okay, let's pause here.
There's so much.
Yeah, we're gonna pause here for a minute. Okay, so so are folks following what's happened here, or do you want me to sum it up again?
It's it's complicated for me. Yeah.
So there's 3 sons. The first 2 die. Judah then sends Tamar away, thinking she's a curse. He never has any intention of marrying her to his 3rd son, because his 2 sons died. He doesn't want his 3rd son to die. So she obviously is aware of this. She's sent back to just be a widow in her father's home. So she becomes aware of this and wants to have a child and trick Judah. So she plays a harlot and has sex with Judah and then has these children, and then she knows she's going to be uplifted. But then Judah doesn't know that it was her. She smartly, right, gets his actual objects. So instead of the kid, which she could have never identified as his, she has his actual objects. But she does something really interesting. She just sends them to him. She doesn't even though he says, "Let's burn her," she sends them to him. She doesn't disclose him publicly. And then he says, "She is more righteous than I." So that's what's happened in that parsha right there. I mean, in that section of this parsha. So, Shifra, I'm not sure if you want to comment on this or the last thing, but go for it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had to go off because my computer the sound goes off and on. Yeah, now I'm trying to remember what I was going to share. You asked the question about when somebody's jealous of you, like, what do you do? Like, I've often been jealous of people, and I mostly I've been pretty low income, but there was a period where I had an inheritance, and I had a friend who was upset about it and like wanted the money, and so I made the decision to give her something. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was something. So I chose to handle it. That was how I chose to handle it. And I had never really thought about, I just thought Joseph was, he was a little bit of a braggart when he was young. And I didn't think about that he might have been feeling like 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 the upset because his mother had died. And maybe the other reason that he was picked over Benjamin was that his mother died while giving birth to him. So that might have made him more, I don't know, more something because of that. And I don't know, not to exactly bring in the New Testament, but it reminds me like her actions when she says, "Oh, well, the person who's you're going to burn me, but the person whose garments these are is the Father." It reminds me of the thing with Jesus, and I always had the feeling with that story when he says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I don't think it was just a general statement of principle. I have a feeling that those were the men that slept with her and they knew it and that it was very pointed. So I don't know. It's like an echo. I know they're not the same book, but it's just an echo of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Debbie.
Okay, well, there's a lot in this, and I'm not going to go into everything. The first thing that hit me was that Yud-Hey Vav-Hey didn't like the young man or whatever and killed him. And that
Two
just
of
kind
them.
of, yeah, twice. So that kind of sets us up culturally for a way of looking at death. And, kind of like whose fault is it? And does it have to do with, so good people and, good people are not supposed to die, or, or what does it mean to die? Does it mean that God is unhappy with you? I mean, it just kind of culturally sets us up to look at death in a certain way, unless there's something else in the Torah that says something opposite that could be too, which I don't know about.
That's really interesting, right? Thank you. That's an interesting point. In this in exchange with Judah, she says, Hakir na, identify these, please. Hakir na. She's talking about the staff and the cord, and she's saying, Hakir na, identify these. It's the same exact phrase that Judah says to his dad about the tunic. Hakir na, identify this. Identify, please. Whose tunic is this? So commentators talk about the fact that this is the beginning of Judah's kind of awakening about what he did. And that's why he can say, oh, she's more righteous than I, because he's having a realization that what he did with his brother Joseph was not okay. Just like, because she now is like, Hakirna, it's the same exact words. Those words do not appear a lot in the Torah. So it's meaningful. Yeah, Rachel.
One thing that always gets me about this parsha is the use of clothing to deceive. The brothers used Joseph's coat or tunic to deceive Jacob. Tamar dresses up as a harlot to deceive Judah. And later on, Potiphar's wife takes Joseph's shirt and uses it to deceive her husband. It seems that it seems significant to me, the use of clothing as a deception, that what's on the outside is not necessarily what's true.
Right, that's beautiful. How we're enclothed is not a necessary reflection of our inner reality, the inner truth. That's beautiful, Rachel. Thank you. Yeah, Roger.
Well, there's a lot of these kinds of things in the Bible and in Shakespeare plays and Moliere and all this stuff with these sort of far-fetched deceptions about identity. And I don't even know if we're supposed to believe them. And this seems like one of those, and I don't know who it's covering for. Possibly it's covering for Judah, since it would have been acceptable for him to go to a prostitute, right. But not have an affair, consensual or otherwise, with his daughter-in-law.
Right.
So, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of deceptions, right? There's the deception of Jacob and Esau, that Jacob and his mother pulled on his father, and so yeah, there's plenty of deceptions happening in this story. One of the things, Andre, I'll let you go, and then I'll just say something else. Please go ahead.
It's just a reflection on the idea of prostitute, which somehow, I guess, offends me, that these guys are sleeping around all over the place, but all of a sudden this woman becomes a prostitute. It just, I don't know, it's like, I decide who's a prostitute and I decide who's not, or I decide who I can sleep with and anybody else is a prostitute. It just shocks me, that's all.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a good entree to what I was going to talk about, which is, so we're gonna read in a minute. We're gonna get to it, but another Potiphar's wife, and how she, as Rachel just talked about, deceives both Joseph and her husband. But these two stories, to me, and I'll say this, and then we'll go read it, and then we'll come back and discuss this, and that'll be the end of our Torah discussion. But the question or the thought that I want to place here as a bookmark for us is like, how can women, or how do women, and how can women use their power, and what is the source of their power in a patriarchal system that disempowers and discounts women? And how do they do that in ways that actually disrupt the patriarchal system? So I'm gonna let you sit with that, so we can read the rest, so we can see what happens with Potiphar and his wife and Joseph. So it was Evelyn, I think. Are you okay still reading?
Can someone else read? That would be great. Thank you.
Sometimes it's hard to read and follow at the same time. Somebody else want to read?
This is Brent. I can try reading if you'd like.
Thank you.
When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his prefect, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. Hashem Adonai was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that Hashem, or God Adonai, was with him, and that Adonai lent success to everything he undertook, he took a liking to Joseph. He made him his personal attendant and put him in charge of his household, placing in his hands all that he owned. And from the time that the Egyptian put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, Hashem Adonai, God, blessed his house for Joseph's sake, so that the blessing of Adonai, Hashem, God, was upon everything that he owned, in the house and outside. He left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and with him there, he paid attention to nothing save the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master gives me no thought to anything in this house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God, Hashem? And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her. One day he came into the house to do his work, and none of the household being there inside. She caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. And when she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And he heard me screaming at the top of my voice. He left his garment with me and got away and fled outside. She kept his garment beside her until his master came home, her master also. Then she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to me to dally with me. But when I screamed at the top of my lungs, at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside." When his master heard the story that his wife told him, namely that thus and so your slave did to me, he was furious. So Joseph's master had him put in prison where the king's prisoners were confined. But even while he was in prison,
I'm gonna end us there. There's more to the story, but in the interest of time, so we can talk about this a little bit, I'm gonna end us here. Thank you very much for reading, Brent. Everybody get down. So now you're seeing this other instance, right, of women exerting power in a patriarchal system. I don't know if you picked up on something that I find significant in the story, which is she's saying, lie with me, have sex with me. And he says, wait, I want to give me 1 second. I think I wrote it down. The exact words were. And she says, basically, everything, there was no one greater in this house than I. And he, Pharaoh, has denied me nothing but you. Since you are his wife, how then can I perpetrate this great evil and have sinned against God? In other words, he's saying to her, I'm more powerful than you. Right? He's saying, I have everything in this house. I'm so powerful. I'm not gonna give that up. So there's power dynamics happening, right, in this patriarchal system, right, with Judah and Tamar. Judah has all the power, and here the power dynamic is kind of confusing or complex, perhaps more complex than with Judah and Tamar. But Tamar flips that power imbalance, right? She exerts her own power in some ways, so she can have children and have a place in society besides just being a widow. And then here, Potiphar's wife is basically, let's say, jealous of Joseph because Joseph has the king's attention and getting everything, and she doesn't. And then she exerts her power as a woman and as somebody with higher political, economic, social standing to get Joseph put into prison. So I find this disruption, like, and in both instances, right, women are using their objective sex, basically power of sex, whether they're engaging in sex or not. They're using their sexuality to exert their power. I find this interesting. So I'm curious, any thoughts or reflections, and how do we disrupt power imbalance in society? And in this instance, right, there's no movements happening. It's not like they're engaging in movement work. They're doing it as individuals. There's not a feminist movement happening here that we're aware of. Maybe we could write a midrash, right? That Tamar is having conversations with other widows that have been sent back to their home communities and saying, hey, the only way we're going to get recognition and power is if we have kids. So we're going to trick men into having kids with us, and then we'll have status in the society.
Really? But what they do ends up being totally crucial to the story of the people. Like Tamar is one of King David's ancestors, and without Potiphar's wife, you wouldn't have the whole enslavement of the people in Egypt, and the whole Exodus, and and like it's almost like they're doing what God needed them to do to make everything happen.
Right. This is the way God wanted it to unfold, so it's happening that way. Jeff, and then I saw Rachel. I'm not sure if you still want to talk, Rachel.
Just briefly, it doesn't seem like there's a movement here. It seems like both of these acts are personal.
Yes, that's what I was saying.
Yeah. Right. I just wanted to, yeah.
Yeah, I was just envisioning, I was writing a midrash as if there would be a movement.
I see.
That's what I was like, oh, let's write a midrash as if there was a movement and these women were connecting with each other and figuring out how to disrupt patriarchy.
Right.
And so they were conversations, and you could imagine that could be happening, right? Like it's not in the story, but you could imagine that women, even though they seem isolated and disempowered, they're actually powerful. And so we could imagine, I'd like to imagine that they actually were in conversation with each other, right? And that they actually were telling each other, how do you enact power in a society in which you're really not experiencing power?
I had one other question, though. It's a little bit. So in part of the story, it says that Potiphar sees that God is with Joseph. How does he see that?
Because all these riches, all this, he's getting getting richer and more secure.
Oh,
Absorbing,
so
getting
God is with him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He figures God must be with him.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Roger, and then Brent.
Just about the rabbi's comment about it not being a movement. If I can quote Rabbi Mao, he said something like, where there's oppression, there's resistance. So if it isn't going to take place in a movement, it's going to take place individually. And we kind of saw a recent example of that in the shooting of the CEO. And, that's what happens. So.
Yeah, good analogy. Yeah. Brent.
The passage that I was reading, I take it a little differently because it says Pharaoh's wife was eyeing Joseph. They were in the same household, and was eyeing Joseph. So she felt attracted or lustful or desired him, and she doesn't mention power. I don't know how, we don't get indications of what she was thinking beyond that, but Joseph turns her down because he doesn't want to risk losing the power he has. So so it's not so she's not trying. Well, it appears to me from the initially she's not trying to get power or interrupt what's going on. If he had, one possibility is if Joseph had agreed, they could have had an affair or whatever, at least in the short term, and maybe it would have been okay. It would be a risk for him and a risk for her. That's why she needed to come up with that scheme. They would be both taking a risk, and obviously Joseph from the story wasn't up to that. But anyway, so it seems a woman asserting her desires can be is a positive thing that I think many of us would feel. And Joseph reserving his right to refuse is also okay. So I think then the story devolves a bit, but up to that point, I think it's kosher. I mean, it's not kosher exactly, but it's normal human interactions without thinking of all the other or apparently not thinking of all the other implications. Okay, thank you.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, when I'm reading this, I can't read it without looking at the power dynamics and talking about those power dynamics. And then when Joseph says to her, I have everything in this house, I'm reading that as being dismissive of her power in the house and the power dynamic between them. And that potentially could be what then causes her to then grab his jacket and accuse him of raping her. Up until then, she hadn't done that. But we don't know. Yeah. So thank you, Brent. Rachel, and then we're going to wrap up.
About Tamar. In her father's house, as a widow in her father's house, she has absolutely no standing.
Right.
She can't marry, so she has no value to her father as a daughter. And so it's even less, she even has less power than the typical woman. But also, if she does have a child, the child needs to be from Judah's family because of her marriage to So I love what she does.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's pretty smart. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm going to end just by giving off a little bit of the Haftorah just because it connects so beautifully, and I think it'll wrap us up, and then we'll close up. We're a little bit later today. Thanks for hanging in there. It was a rich parsha, and I'm glad we got through the different themes that I wanted to touch upon. So it's Amos 2:6 to 3:8. We're not going to pull it up. I'm just going to give it off for a little bit. So in this prophetic text, what's happening is that Amos is criticizing the people. God is willing to kind of accept and maybe somewhat ignore the sins of idolatry, adultery, and murder. But there's a fourth sin that the people connect that we could say pushes God over the deep end, if you will, that reaches God's edge of tolerance. And that was the sin of the persecution of the poor and the greed that caused the rich and powerful to take advantage of the helpless and to pervert justice in order to get their way. That was more than God could stand, and that was what led to the downfall of the nation. They would sell their legal rights of poor people for a few pieces of silver, as Joseph's brother did in this text, and they would grind the poor into the ground, figuratively, and cover their heads with dust. Lest these leaders think they are too powerful to be brought to justice. What we know is that previous inhabitants of the land thought that they too were too powerful to be brought to justice, and God swept them away. And the text ends by saying, essentially, the power is God's alone. Halavai, if only right now this source of divine, loving justice, compassionate justice would be what was, meting out justice, because, right? Like the persecution of the poor and the greed that caused the rich and powerful to take advantage of the helpless and pervert justice in order to get their way. And so here we are, thousands of years later. Maybe we could withstand idolatry and adultery and murder, but this is just too much. It's too much. And when justice, and that's the V'haya'im Shemoa prayer that we do in English, which is when social, economic, and political systems become so unjust that the mitzvot of caring for the poor and the vulnerable and the stranger is no longer part of our mandate, no longer something that we do, that the ecological systems will become unbalanced too, and we will be thrown off the land. So we started with the parsha saying, if you're striving to be a righteous person, because all of us are on the journey, or hopefully we're on the journey. If you're striving to be a righteous person, then don't settle for what is. Be a part of the transformative power of the universe, because in fact you are. And be a part of that energy that makes possible the transformation from what is to that which can and ought to be. Never become settled with what is until we see that day of Mashiach that we've brought forth, when truly love and justice are flourishing for all of us. Thank you for a rich Torah study. And we'll just close out with the blessings and prayers, ending prayers. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata betochenu brucha ya Shekhinah notenet haTorah. Amen.